Joining me now, Charlie Sykes, editor-at-large at The Bulwark, USA Today Washington Bureau Chief Susan Page, and Eugene Daniels, White House reporter for Politico. And I believe an MSNBC contributor, Eugene, since I've last seen you, which is a great news indeed. Charlie, first, your reaction to that ad by Governor Ivey, and more broadly, the far-right turn, as we are describing it, in some Republican strategy.
Yeah, well, I think that the Republicans who think that the wind is at their back this year don't feel any sort of constraint either in terms of taste or moderation. And so this is what you're seeing. You're seeing it in Florida. You're seeing it in Alabama. You're seeing it from the governor of Texas. So I think that at this point in the campaign, though, what Democrats need to understand is that if they're going to survive the midterms, they need this not to be a referendum, but rather to be a choice. It has to be a choice between what we stand for and what they stand for. If it's a referendum, the Democrats are going to face some very, very heavy headwinds. But I do think that they need to be more aggressive in making this a binary issue. Like, look, you may have issues with us, but is this what you think America should be? Is this where you want to go? And unfortunately, you're going to see a lot more ads like the one you just played.
And they traditionally have worked. Susan Page, you know, I remember covering Jesse Helms' Senate reelection back in the 90s, in the early 90s. I think it was the 92 campaign, the White Hands commercial. Look it up. You know, Susan, I think you remember it. It was just awful, but it worked for them in North Carolina. And just moments ago, by the way, let me just also point out, moments ago, Florida's Governor Ron DeSantis signed a ban on abortions after 15 weeks. Yesterday in Kentucky, Republicans overrode Governor Beshear's veto of a sweeping abortion bill. And earlier this week, Oklahoma's Republican governor made abortion a felony. So the question here is, would this ultimately fire up Democrats and independents instead of just firing up the Republican base? After that long question on racism.
Democrats have been counting on abortion to get their base excited in anticipation, in dreaded anticipation of a Supreme Court decision that will make it much easier for states to limit abortions. But, you know, the fact is we've seen these state actions in anticipation of that Supreme Court decision, and it has failed so far to really move the needle. We see Democratic voters not enthused about voting and not engaged in this election, while Republicans are all riled up. And so perhaps we'll see a Democratic reaction. But we're just 7 months out, and we haven't seen signs of that yet, Andrea.
And, Eugene, there's a new law in Alabama. Again, this goes back to Kay Ivey, making a gender-affirming care a felony. Nationally, more than 300 bills targeting the LGBTQ community have been introduced this year alone. So why this relentless focus on an already marginalized group?
Yeah, what it appears to be happening here is creating a boogeyman, boogie woman, boogie person for Republican voters, like Susan said, to get them even further riled up than they already are on the Republican side as we head into the midterms. Some of these bills, you talk about like the Don't Say Gay bills that are out there. No, there's not a lot of teaching, if any, of third graders about sex and gender, right? But when you think about the way that this world works, kids are constantly seeing, as a gay kid myself, I was watching Disney movies seeing men and women kiss, right? So is that teaching them about sex and gender roles? And so when you talk to LGBTQ advocates, they're really worried. Like Charlie said, they are expecting and hoping that Democrats fight more about this. But I will say, when it comes to Republicans, they do risk the possibility of turning off voters who are most likely to make a difference in a midterm, right? People that are in the suburban women and men who see some of these culture wars, quote unquote, and have concerns about that. There's also the question about the future of the party, right? You talk to young Republicans and they will tell you some of this stuff turns them off and makes them not excited about where the party is going. So Democrats, if they take the opportunity to really paint Republicans as anti-LGBTQ, anti-women, as some of them tell me they're going to be doing this year, and tell their own story of their accomplishments, they may be able to at least stem some of the bleeding that we might be seeing this year. But Republicans have clearly made it clear what they're going to be talking about as we move forward.
But Charlie, there's also the issue of guns. And with all the gun violence we've seen just this week, of course, with the illegal gun being used allegedly in New York on that subway, Georgia Governor Kemp signing a bill Tuesday allowing residents to carry handguns without a license. This amid rising gun violence nationally. How is that playing likely to change key states like Georgia?
Again, the Republicans think the gun issue works for them. Here in Wisconsin, I argued against the idea. I was in favor of concealed carry for people who had training in the use of the gun, who had background checks. This new push, though, gives you an indication of how extreme it's going. Look, guns are going to work for Republicans in swing states. Democrats need to understand the way the crime issue is playing out. I know that a lot of Democrats think that they can address the rising crime issue by talking about guns. That is important that they do it, but it's not sufficient. And I think that what you're seeing in a lot of cities around the country, including New York, is Democrats realizing that they do have a problem with this. This is a wedge issue, and that they're going to have to find a way to counter the Republican surge on immigration, on the border, and on issues like rising urban crime. I don't want to relitigate the whole defund the police movement, but clearly I think that the Biden White House understands they have an issue. What they need to do is find a way to establish their credibility on this in a way that they perhaps didn't have over the last several years.
And Susan, there's news now from Ronna McDaniel and the RNC. The RNC is just voting, and we've heard some preliminary steps toward this, voting against participating in the 2024 debates if they are led by the Commission on Presidential Debates, which has led these debates in a bipartisan way for decades, objecting to the choices of moderators, to the format, to the other decisions made in 2020. Now, we know there's a long way down the road, and we don't know who's going to be in charge of the Republican National Committee and what's going to happen in the midterms and a lot of other things, but they're staking a claim against what they have been long criticizing, which is the Commission on Debates.
This is really terrible news, I think, because the Commission on Presidential Debates was formed to take control of the debate process in presidential elections, to set up an infrastructure that made it hard for candidates of either party to refuse to debate. And if we're going to go back to the kind of Wild West we had before then, where you had endless negotiations and different organizers trying to host debates, you run the risk of not having presidential debates, of not having the two candidates who are vying to lead our nation being forced to stand side by side and answer independent-minded questions. So I think this has been a long time coming. Republicans have long been unhappy with the commission, but I think this is bad news for our democracy.
And it just reinforces, Charlie, the extent to which Donald Trump has taken over the Republican Party.
Yeah, no, I don't think you can overstate that. I know there's been a lot of wish casting about, maybe his grip is loosening, but the reality is that he's calling the shots, and what he's doing is he's forcing the party not simply to embrace the big lie, but to embrace the most extreme versions of that. And so you see his impact in one state after another. And it will be interesting to see whether or not, if Republicans win in the midterm elections, they see that as some sort of a validation, and that Trump sees that as some sort of a validation. But people should not be under any illusions that the Republican Party is anything other than a wholly owned subsidiary of Trump world.
And Eugene, finally, Governor DeSantis again putting his imprint on redistricting, rejecting a Republican-led legislature's plan, which was favoring Republicans, and instead superimposing his own plan, which apparently they're now going to ratify, which is to create 4 additional Republican-leaning seats and eliminate at least 2 districts, congressional seats now held by Black Democrats, minority-led districts. So this would be pretty dramatic in Florida, which is all important. As we know, Florida.
Exactly. Every single year, every single election. One of the things that's really interesting, you talk to critics and they talk about the fact that it gets rid of those two minority majority districts and those members of Congress. But it's also something that's really interesting is the power that DeSantis now holds in his state, right? The way it was set up is that, the state legislature would handle how this would be drawn, and this was, they would just sign off on it. And now you have a governor and governor's team who are doing the opposite, who are taking control over what that redistricting process looks like. And when we talk to experts, they have concerns about this. Susan has used the word undemocratic. They feel like that is also dangerous and puts us onto that same road. And they feel like it's all connected with some of the things we've been seeing from the Republican Party. That is chasing after, at the very least, what they think Donald Trump would want if they aren't, because we aren't hearing from him as much. And so that's something to keep your eyes on as the Republican Party moves forward.
Well, thanks to all.